The telegram arrived at the Presidio del Norte station at 2:30 in the morning, and Roy Hayes read it standing in the doorway of his post, the desert wind cutting cold across his face, while every word on that yellow paper carved itself into the lining of his chest like a brand. Need help, stop, ELVIRA, BROOKS, stop, nobody left, stop, please, stop. He read it 3 times. Then a fourth. His fingers pressed so hard against the paper that the edges crinkled, and the ink smeared at the corner where his thumb had found the word nobody. Nobody left. He had been a Texas Ranger for 11 years. He had buried partners, survived ambushes, tracked killers through the Chihuahuan desert for weeks without water. He had never once, not in 11 years, abandoned his post without formal relief, without orders, without the blessing of his captain, and the chain of command that held the frontier together like the binding on a worn Bible. He was walking to the stable before the thought finished forming. His deputy, a young man named Cobb, was sitting outside on the wooden bench with a lantern and a tin cup of coffee, and the look on Cobb's face when Roy passed him without stopping told Roy everything he needed to know about what his face must have looked like in that moment. "Hayes," Cobb called after him, "where are you going at this hour? You have a prisoner transfer in the morning, you have the regional hearing at noon." Roy stopped at the stable door with his hand on the latch and turned halfway back. "Wire Captain Aldridge in Langtry. Tell him I've had a family emergency and I'm riding south. Tell him I'll explain when I return." "You don't have any family," Cobb said carefully. Roy pushed the stable door open and went inside without answering, because that was the problem, wasn't it? He didn't have any family. And neither did Elvira Brooks, apparently, and that was exactly why he was saddling his horse at 2 in the morning and riding 60 miles into the darkness toward a woman he hadn't seen in 3 years, a woman who had never once asked anything of him in all the years he'd known her, a woman who had told him plainly and without drama that she could take care of herself and always had been able to. Nobody left. He rode through the night with the stars overhead so thick and bright they looked like spilled salt on black cloth, the kind of sky that only existed in the deep southwestern territories in the year 1882, where civilization had barely scraped the surface of the land, and the land had no particular interest in being civilized. The hooves of his roan gelding, a horse named McCaffrey for no reason Roy could now remember, struck the hardpan in a steady rhythm that usually calmed him on long rides. Tonight it did nothing but count the seconds he wasn't there. He thought about the first time he had met Elvira Brooks. It had been the spring of 1879, and he had been riding through the small settlement of Cobber Crossing, a town so new it still smelled of fresh-cut timber and ambition. He had been tracking a man named Duluth Ward, a cattle thief with a habit of leaving witnesses in worse condition than the cattle. Ward had gone to ground somewhere in the territory east of the Rio Grande, and Roy had been following a trail that had gone cold twice already. He had stopped at the only establishment in Cobber Crossing that appeared to serve food, a combination general store and eating house run out of a single building with 2 rooms and a curtain in between. A woman had brought him a plate of beans and cornbread without asking what he wanted, and when he'd looked up to thank her, he'd found himself staring at a pair of dark brown eyes so direct and unashamed that he'd forgotten the word he was about to say. She'd been 24 years old then. She had brown hair the color of dark honey that she wore braided and pinned back in a way that suggested she'd made her peace with functionality over ornament. She had a narrow jaw and a wide mouth and a small scar above her left eyebrow that Roy would later learn came from the corner of a cabinet she'd walked into at age 9, and not from anything more dramatic, though her expression always suggested there might have been something more dramatic involved. "You're a ranger," she'd said, not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "You tracking Duluth Ward?" He'd set down his fork. "What do you know about Duluth Ward?" "I know he came through here 2 days ago and helped himself to 6 horses from the Mendoza family's corral without paying for them, and that he ate here and left without paying for that either, and that when I pointed out the second fact, he put his hand around my wrist and told me I was lucky he was feeling generous. She'd set her own hands flat on the table across from him, and he'd noticed the faint bruising still yellow at her left wrist. I know he rode east on the Laredo Road. I know his horse had a loose shoe on the left front, and it would have thrown him by morning if it hadn't been replaced. I know there's only one farrier between here and the river. Roy had stared at her for a long moment. "You've been tracking him yourself," he'd said. "I've been gathering information," she'd corrected. "I don't have the legal authority to do anything with it." He had caught Duluth Ward the following day at a farrier's shed in a place called Encino Bluff. He'd come back through Cobber Crossing to tell her, because it had seemed like the right thing to do, and she'd set a piece of dried apple pie in front of him without being asked and sat down across from him at the table to hear about it. That had been the beginning. Not a romance at first, nothing so defined and declared. It had been a slow understanding between two people who were both, in their separate ways, people who solved problems and kept their own counsel, and rarely needed anything from anyone. He had ridden through Cobber Crossing 4 more times in the following year, always with a reason related to his work in the territory, though he had gradually become aware that his routes were shaping themselves with an almost embarrassing predictability around that particular settlement. She had always known he was coming before he arrived, because someone always saw a ranger's horse on the eastern road and word traveled fast in small towns, and she had always acted as though his arrival were simply a natural event requiring no particular acknowledgement, the way sunrise required no particular acknowledgement. They had talked for hours on those visits, about everything and nothing, about the law and its limitations and its occasional corruptions, about the land and the people who'd been here before the settlers and the injustice in the way those people had been pushed aside and diminished. An injustice Elvira spoke about with a quiet fury that Roy had learned early on not to try to redirect or argue down because she was right and they both knew it. About books, because she had a small collection of them on a shelf behind the counter, and she lent them to him one at a time, and they discussed them on his return trips with the seriousness of people who treated the printed word as something sacred and rare. He had never told her directly what she meant to him. He was a man who had built his life around duty and order, and the understanding that attachment was a vulnerability in a profession where vulnerability got people killed. He had watched 3 partners die. He had watched a man he'd considered a friend get shot in the back by a cattle baron's hired men, and had spent 18 months bringing those men to justice through the very legal system that had turned away from the problem for 2 years before Roy got involved. He had learned, in the way that certain people learn certain things, that caring for something too much was a trap the world was always setting and always springing. But Elvira Brooks was not a trap. She was something that could not be neatly categorized and filed, and that had frightened him in a way that Ward and his type never had. The last time he had seen her was 3 years before the telegram. It had been a difficult visit, the conversation arriving eventually at a place where the unspoken things between them had pressed too hard against the silence, and something had cracked. He could not remember now exactly how it had begun. He thought she had said something about his habit of leaving before dawn, of never staying through the morning. He thought he had said something about the nature of his work requiring him to be in motion. And then she had looked at him with those direct brown eyes and said, very quietly and without any accusation in her voice at all, which somehow made it worse, "Roy, what is it that you're actually afraid of?" And he had not answered her, which was itself an answer, and he had ridden out before dawn the following morning, and he had not come back. He had thought about her every day in the 3 years since. He had dismissed those thoughts with the efficiency of a man who had trained himself to dismiss things, and then he had thought about her again, and then he had dismissed it again, and this had been the rhythm of the last 3 years of his life, this back and forth inside his own chest that he had never spoken of to any living person. The telegram had ended all of it, not solved it, not answered the question she'd asked him that night, but ended the part where he could keep riding away, because she had never once asked anything of him, and now she had asked one thing. And whatever the cost, whatever the consequences with the captain and the transfer and the hearing and 11 years of perfect duty, there was simply no version of Roy Hayes that did not ride toward Elvira Brooks when she said she had no one else to call. He reached the outskirts of Cobber Crossing as the sky was beginning to silver in the east, still dark enough that the lanterns in the windows of the buildings gave the whole small town a warm amber glow that looked from a distance like something precious and fragile, the way lantern light always looked from a distance in the desert, like it was the last warmth left on earth. McCaffrey was breathing hard from the long run, and Roy walked him the last quarter-mile to cool him down, his own body stiff and cold from the night ride, his hands numb inside his gloves. The eating house had a light in the window. Roy tied McCaffrey to the post outside and stepped up onto the low wooden porch and knocked on the door, and the door opened so fast that whoever was on the other side of it had been standing right there waiting. It was not Elvira. It was a woman Roy didn't recognize, older than Elvira, with gray threading through dark hair and a red-eyed, sleepless look that communicated immediately that something serious had been happening for longer than a night. "You're the ranger," the woman said, in the tone of someone who is both relieved and surprised, as if she hadn't quite believed the telegram would work. "Roy Hayes, yes. Where is she?" The woman opened the door wider and stepped back, and Roy came into the eating house, and the familiar smell of it, flour and coffee and the particular dusty warmth of a room with a cast-iron stove, hit him with a force he was completely unprepared for, 3 years of distance collapsing into nothing in one inhaled breath. "She's in the back room," the woman said. "She wouldn't let me send for anyone until she'd tried the telegram. She's been sick for 4 days, real sick, the fever kind that doesn't break, and I didn't know what else to do, and she said she had one person she thought might come." The woman's voice caught slightly. "She said it had to be you." The dark pass that Roy had built out of distance and discipline cracked down the center. He crossed the eating house in 4 strides and pushed through the curtain into the back room that served as Elvira's private quarters, and what he saw stopped him as effectively as a wall. She was lying on the narrow iron-frame bed with 2 quilts over her despite the fact that the room was warm from a small stove in the corner, and even in the lantern light, even at a distance of 10 feet, he could see that the fever had been working on her for days. Her face was pale and damp, her hair loose from its usual braid and spread across the pillow in a dark tangle. She looked smaller than he remembered. Not fragile. Elvira Brooks was constitutionally incapable of looking fragile, but reduced, as if the illness had been burning her down to her most essential elements. And then she opened her eyes and looked directly at him, and the look was so completely and characteristically Elvira, sharp and assessing and containing within it both absolute recognition and something else, something that might have been relief if she'd been the kind of person who allowed herself to show relief, that he felt the whole complicated structure of what he felt for her crystallize into something clear and simple and irrefutable. "You came," she said. Her voice was rough from the fever, lower than usual. "I came," he said. "I didn't know if you would. I know." He moved to the chair beside her bed and sat down without taking his coat off and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "I should have given you more reason to know." She studied him for a moment and then, very carefully, she closed her eyes again. "There's a doctor in Onyate," she said. "That's 40 miles. I wouldn't let Martha send for him because I thought I could wait it out, and the 40 miles seemed too far to ask anyone to go. I was wrong about waiting it out." "I'll get him," Roy said. "You just rode 60 miles. "I'll get him," Roy said again. Her hand, resting on top of the quilt, moved the smallest amount toward him, and he covered it with his without any deliberation at all, without the hesitation that had kept him circling her life for 3 years without committing to it, just his hand over hers, and he felt her fingers turn slightly to press against his palm. "Roy," she said, without opening her eyes. "What? What happened to your hearing at noon?" He almost laughed. It was so exactly her. "It'll keep," he said. Your prisoner transfer. Cobb can manage it." She was quiet for a moment. He could hear the woman named Martha in the other room, the soft sound of something being set on the stove. "I didn't know who else to call," Elvira said quietly. "I know," he said. "I'm glad you called me." Roy did not leave her side for another 2 hours until he was certain the fever hadn't spiked further in the night and that she was resting as well as she could rest. Then he went out and spoke briefly with Martha, who turned out to be Elvira's neighbor from across the road and whose husband had died the previous winter, leaving her with her own set of difficulties that had prevented her from riding for the doctor herself. Roy learned from Martha the things he needed to know. The fever had started 4 days ago with what had seemed like ordinary chills. Elvira had refused bed rest for the first 2 days, insisting she could run the eating house through it, and Martha had found her collapsed in the kitchen on the 3rd morning. Since then she'd been in the bed, but the fever had not broken, and Martha, who had some knowledge of such things from nursing her husband through his last illness, was frightened. Roy rode for Anyate before full sunrise, pushing McCaffrey as hard as he dared, stopping once at a creek crossing to let the horse drink and rest for 10 minutes while Roy sat on the bank and looked at the reddening sky and had a direct and honest conversation with himself about what he was doing. He was not riding for a doctor out of simple duty to a citizen of the territory. He was riding for a doctor because the thought of Elvira Brooks dying in a back room in Cobber Crossing, while he had been sitting at his post in Presidio del Norte, reading law bulletins and maintenance reports, was the most unbearable thought he had ever entertained, more unbearable than the death of his partners, more unbearable than the long solitary years of his profession, and that told him something that he should have acknowledged long ago. Something he intended to acknowledge the moment she was well enough to have the conversation. He reached Anyate at mid-morning, found the doctor, a man named Whitmore who was 60-some years old and seemed annoyed at being found before he'd finished his breakfast, and managed to convey the urgency of the situation with the precise economy of language that Rangers used when they needed civilian cooperation quickly. Dr. Whitmore finished his coffee, packed his bag, and they rode back to Cobber Crossing together, the doctor on a substantial bay mare that kept pace well. Roy learned from Dr. Whitmore on the ride that there had been a recurrent fever moving through several settlements in the territory, brought in by a wagon train that had passed through 3 weeks prior. Several people had died from it, primarily the very young and the very old. The ones in the middle range, if their constitutions were sound, typically turned a corner around the 5th or 6th day. "Is her constitution sound?" Roy asked. The doctor glanced at him sideways. "I'll tell you better once I've seen her." Roy held his tongue and rode. When they arrived back at Cobber Crossing, Elvira was awake and sitting up slightly, which Martha reported as a good sign. She looked at Dr. Whitmore with the expression of a woman who had been managing her own affairs successfully for long enough that she was not entirely comfortable with someone else being brought in to manage them. And she looked at Roy with an expression he could not entirely read, something layered and complex and containing, he thought, a warmth she was not quite ready to name. Dr. Whitmore examined her for a considerable time, asked her questions about her symptoms, the progression of the fever, what she'd been eating and drinking, while Roy stood outside the curtain in the eating house and drank a cup of coffee Martha had pressed into his hands and tried to appear calmer than he felt. The verdict, when the doctor emerged, was serious but not dire. The fever was the one going through the territory. Her constitution was, as Whitmore put it with some approval, notably sound. She needed rest, proper fluid intake, a particular compound he would leave with Martha, and she needed someone to ensure she actually stayed in the bed instead of trying to run the eating house, because the risk with this particular illness was a relapse if the patient pushed herself too soon. "Is there family to stay with her?" Whitmore asked Roy. "No family," Roy said. "Close friend, spouse, someone of that nature." Roy looked at the curtain. "I'll stay," he said. He had not planned to say it. It came out of him with the naturalness of something that had always been true, and once it was said, it settled into the air of the room without argument. He wired Captain Aldridge from the telegraph office at the Anyate Junction, which required a 3-mile ride back east, and the message he sent was careful and honest. Personal emergency, civilian requiring assistance, requesting 2 weeks emergency leave, full report to follow. Aldridge's reply came back within 4 hours, and it was exactly what Roy had expected from a man who had known him 11 years. Emergency leave granted. Cobb reassigned as interim. Hayes, you had better have an excellent explanation when you return. Roy sent back one word. Yes. He spent the first 3 days of Elvira's illness in the eating house, sleeping a few hours at a time in the chair by the door when Martha was with her, taking the night watch when Martha needed sleep. The other residents of Cobber Crossing, when they understood that someone was finally looking after their Elvira, rallied in the practical, undemonstrative way of frontier people. Old Mr. Sandoval from down the road brought firewood. The Mendoza family, whose horses Duluth Ward had stolen 3 years earlier, and who had never forgotten that it was a tip from Elvira that had led to their recovery, sent 2 of their daughters over with food each morning, enough to feed the eating house without Elvira needing to cook. A man named Prescott, who had a small ranch outside of town, offered to tend to McCaffrey, and Roy accepted with genuine gratitude. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Roy was alone in the room with her when it happened. It was early morning, the sky outside the single small window still dark, and he had been sitting in the chair with a book from her shelf, reading by lantern light, when he heard her breathing change. He looked up, and she was looking back at him with eyes that were clearer than they'd been in days, the glassy fever distance gone from them, and she was sweating through the quilts with the sharp, productive sweat of a fever that had reached its turning point. He got her fresh water and a cloth, and changed the quilts for a dry one from the chest at the foot of the bed, and he did all of this with the matter-of-fact competence of a man who had nursed partners through gunshot wounds and desert dehydration, and knew how to do what needed to be done without making a fuss about it. And she let him, which was itself remarkable, because Elvira Brooks did not typically let anyone do things for her. When she was settled again with the dry quilt and the fresh water and a little soup that Martha had left warming on the small stove, she looked at him and said, "You've been here every night." "Yes," he said. "Martha told me." She paused. "She said you barely slept." "I slept enough." "You've been riding posts for 11 years, she said. "You know what sleep deprivation does to a person's judgment." "My judgment seems to be working fairly well," he said. She studied him, and there was something in her face, some softening at the edges, that was different from anything he'd seen there before. Elvira was not a soft woman, not in the negative sense of that word, not in any diminishing sense. She was simply a woman who had been on her own since she was 19 years old, who had built something out of nothing in a settlement that had barely existed when she'd arrived, who had survived the isolation and the hardship and the occasional cruelty of a frontier that had no particular tenderness toward women who were alone and poor and trying to make something of themselves. Softness had not been something she could afford. But looking at him now, in the early morning light, she was allowing something through that she usually kept behind the door of her practicality, and Roy felt the weight of it the way you feel the weight of something precious that someone has handed you to hold. "Why did you really come?" she asked, not accusatory, genuinely asking. "Because you asked," he said. "You could have sent Cobb." "I could have," he agreed, "but you didn't." "No." She looked at the ceiling for a moment, and Roy waited because Elvira always thought before she spoke, and it was worth waiting for. "You left your post," she said. "You've never done that. Martha told me people in town are talking about it. That the ranger came 60 miles in the middle of the night because Elvira sent a telegram." "Let them talk," Roy said. "You could lose your commission." "I won't," he said, "but it wouldn't change the math of it." She turned her head on the pillow and looked at him directly. "What does that mean?" Roy put the book down on the small table beside him and leaned forward with his hands clasped between his knees, the way he sat when he was about to say something that mattered. It means that I have spent 3 years doing what I always do, which is ride away before anything can ask something of me that I don't know how to give," he said. "And I have thought about you every day of those 3 years, every single one." And the telegram came and I was walking to the stable before I'd finished reading it, because there was never a question, Elvira, not for a single second. And I think I need to stop pretending that there's something more important than that. She was quiet for a long moment. "You asked me something the last time I was here," he said. "You asked me what I was afraid of. I didn't answer." "I remember. The answer is that I'm afraid of caring about something so much that losing it would leave me without any working parts," he said. "I've seen what that does to people, and I decided a long time ago that it wouldn't happen to me. And then I met you, and it was already happening, and I kept trying to manage it instead of just admitting what it was." Elvira looked at him for a long time. He held the look without flinching because she deserved to see the thing he was saying actually on his face and not just in carefully chosen words. "Roy," she said finally, "what? You're going to have to give me a little time to feel better before we have the rest of this conversation." The breath he let out was not quite a laugh, but it was close to one. "Take all the time you need." "I will," she said, "but don't leave." "I won't," he said. "Not again." The following days had a quality unlike anything Roy had experienced before. He had lived a life of motion, of purpose defined by movement and mission, and the achievement of specific objectives in specific places. He had never stayed anywhere long enough for daily life to take on the texture of routine, and he had told himself that this was a preference, that he was someone who was simply not built for stillness. What he discovered in Cobber Crossing was that stillness, when the stillness had Elvira in it, was not the deprivation he had imagined. He helped Martha run the eating house while Elvira recovered. He did not know how to cook, but he discovered he could learn the mechanical aspects of it quickly enough, the fire management and the water carrying and the heavy work that needed doing, and he found that he did not mind the learning. The residents of Cobber Crossing treated him with the combination of curiosity and warmth that small towns directed toward anyone connected to someone they loved. And Elvira was clearly someone they loved, in the gruff, practical, frontier way of people who show love through firewood and brought food rather than demonstrative speeches. He spent the evenings in the back room, reading to her from her books when she was too tired to read herself, then talking when she had more energy, the way they had always talked, about everything and nothing, about the law and the land and the books and the world, except that now there was something new in the conversation, a current beneath it that they had both named without fully naming it, a mutual acknowledgement that the distance between them was a choice they were in the process of unmaking. On the 7th day she was on her feet, not fully, not without the occasional need to sit down unexpectedly, but upright and mobile and insisting on being useful, which Roy had expected and had already mentally negotiated with Martha about. They let her supervise while they did the work, which she found almost but not quite as unsatisfactory as actually being incapacitated. He watched her move through her establishment with the proprietary ease of someone who had built it, and knew every creak of the floor and the precise temperature at which the stove made the cornbread right, and the particular set of complaints that Mr. Sandoval would have every Thursday about the coffee, and he felt something that he recognized after a moment as happiness, quiet and warm and completely without the anxious edge that he'd always associated with it. On the 9th day, she came and sat beside him on the front porch in the evening, where he'd been watching the sunset paint the desert in colors that seemed almost theatrical in their beauty, and they sat together for a while without speaking. "I was engaged once," she said, not introducing the topic with any preamble because she never did. "Before I came here, I was 20 years old. He was a man I'd met in San Antonio, a businessman. His name was Franklin Gier, and he seemed, at the time, like exactly the kind of stability I needed." Roy listened without interrupting. "He was involved in something," she said. "I didn't know at first. It was a hidden arrangement with the land office, forged deeds, displacing families from property they'd legitimately held for years. Several of the families were Mexican families who had been on that land since before Texas was Texas. It was the kind of thing that was more common than it should have been and less punished than it deserved. She looked at her hands in her lap. When I found out, I told him I wouldn't marry him unless he stopped. He told me I didn't understand how business worked. I gave back the ring and left San Antonio with everything I owned in one trunk and found this place 6 months later. She was quiet for a moment. I tell you that because I want you to understand why I found it easier to be alone than to trust someone, she said. It wasn't that I was made for solitude. It was that the one time I trusted someone it turned out there was a dark past I hadn't been allowed to see. That's a reasonable lesson to learn, Roy said. It was too comprehensive a lesson, she said. I applied it everywhere, including here. She looked at him sideways, and the last of the sunset light was on her face, warm and golden, and she looked, Roy thought, exactly like herself. You could have told me what you were afraid of 3 years ago. I could have, he agreed. That was my failure, not yours. She turned on the bench to face him more directly. I need you to understand something, Roy. I don't need someone to take care of me. I've been taking care of myself for 5 years in this place, and I'm good at it. What I sent that telegram for was not someone to save me. I know, he said. I sent it because when I was lying in that room with the fever and I thought, really honestly thought, about who I wanted to know I was in trouble, your name was the only one I came up with. And that told me something I'd been not quite admitting to myself. Roy looked at her, and the quality of the evening light and the stillness of the desert around them and the particular honesty in her face combined to make the next thing very easy. The easiest thing he'd said in years. I love you, he said. I have for a long time. I was afraid of it and I made you pay for that fear by staying away, and I'm sorry for it. She held his gaze and something moved across her face, something that was not soft in the fragile sense but was full and real and completely unguarded. I love you too, she said. I've been furious about it for approximately 3 years. He laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere he'd kept closed off, and she smiled at him, and it was the first time he'd seen her smile in a way that did not have any reserve behind it, and it was, he thought, the finest thing he had ever seen. He reached across the bench and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat like that while the last of the light left the sky, and the stars came out over the desert, enormous and bright and indifferent to the small human moment happening beneath them. The following days brought complications he'd been expecting but had not fully planned for, because Roy Hayes, whatever his other qualities, had spent so many years avoiding this particular situation that he was somewhat underprepared for its practical realities. He needed to return to his post. 2 weeks of emergency leave was not indefinite reassignment, and Captain Aldridge, who had been patient because he respected Roy's record, would not remain patient indefinitely. Roy had a responsibility to the territory and to the position and to the work that he had done for 11 years, work that mattered, work that he believed in, work that he was not prepared to simply abandon even for this. And Elvira had her establishment in Cobber Crossing. They discussed this on the 10th morning, sitting across from each other at the table in the eating house, while Martha tactfully found things to do outside. I'm not asking you to leave your post, Elvira said. Her voice had the pragmatic tone she used for difficult logistics. I don't think I'm even prepared to ask you to give up the Rangers because that's 11 years of who you are and I don't want a version of you that has given up who he is. I appreciate that, Roy said, but I need you to be honest with me about what you need, not what's easiest to ask for, what you actually need. She looked at her coffee cup. I need to know you're coming back. I don't mean in a general, hopeful sense. I mean I need that to be a defined and reliable thing, because I spent 3 years not knowing and that was genuinely difficult. I'm coming back, he said. Every time I leave I'm coming back. That's a promise I'm making right now. And the post, Presidio del Norte, is 60 miles from here. I'll speak to Aldridge about reassignment, Roy said. There are 3 posts within 20 miles of Cobber Crossing. It may take time to arrange, but I can request it." She nodded slowly. "And in the meantime, I ride back, I explain myself, I do my duty, and I come back here every chance I have. Which, depending on how the captain responds to my explanation, may be every 2 weeks or may be more." "What are you going to tell him?" she asked. "The truth," Roy said simply. "That I left my post for a personal emergency, that it was the right thing to do, that I'm prepared to accept whatever consequences come of it, and that I'm requesting reassignment to be closer to the person I intend to marry." There was a pause. Elvira looked up from the coffee cup. "That's assuming a considerable amount," she said, but her voice had the quality it had when she was containing something she didn't want to show on her face yet. "Is it wrong?" Roy asked. She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that he felt the familiar thread of anxiety begin, and then she said, "No, it's not wrong." And the thing she'd been containing came through, warm and sure, and she set her hand on the table between them and he covered it with his, the same gesture as the first morning, and it felt already like something that had always been. Roy left Cobber Crossing on the 12th day with McCaffrey rested, and the territory ahead of him familiar and the road behind him, for the first time in his career, something he was actively impatient to return to. Captain Aldridge met him at the door of the Presidio del Norte station with the expression of a man who had been composing his remarks for 2 weeks and was not entirely satisfied with them yet. "Sit down," Aldridge said. Roy sat. "I have read your wire," Aldridge said, settling himself behind the desk with the deliberateness of a man establishing authority, "and I have spoken to Cobb, and I have conducted the prisoner transfer myself, which I want you to know I have not personally done in 7 years, and I am prepared to hear your explanation." Roy gave it to him. All of it, plainly and without embellishment, the way Rangers were supposed to report things. The telegram, the night ride, the fever, the doctor, the medical situation, and the personal situation, which he described with the directness that came from having already been honest with himself and with Elvira about it. Aldridge listened without interrupting, which was not his usual practice. "You left your post," he said when Roy finished, "for a woman you're not married to and are not related to." "Yes," Roy said, "and I would do it again." Aldridge looked at him for a long moment. "How long have you been a ranger, Hayes?" 11 years, 4 months, and 12 days. "In that time have you ever failed to discharge your duty?" "I once gave a wanted man a 12-hour head start because I found out he was running from a situation that had some injustice in it," Roy said. "I reported that to your predecessor. He agreed it was the right call. Other than that, no." Aldridge tapped one finger on the desk. "You're requesting reassignment. To one of the posts within 20 miles of Cobber Crossing, yes. I understand it may take time to arrange." "It will take time." Another pause. "Fort Leaton had a vacancy come up last month. It's 22 miles from Cobber Crossing. If you can accept that and adjust your patrol routes accordingly, I can have the reassignment processed by the end of the month." Roy held very still. "Yes, I can accept that." "There will be a formal notation in your record about the unauthorized leave," Aldridge said. "I'm required to put it there. It will not affect your rank or your pension or my opinion of you, which remains, despite considerable annoyance, a favorable one." He looked at Roy over the top of his papers. "I assume this woman knows what she's getting into." "She knows more clearly than most people I've ever met," Roy said. "Then God help her," Aldridge said with what was, Roy suspected, the closest thing to warmth that Aldridge typically permitted himself. "Take the week. Get your affairs here in order. Cobb is transferred to the Anyate station effective next week anyway, so the timing works out. And Hayes." Roy, who had already begun to rise, paused. "When you get married," Aldridge said without looking up from his papers, "I expect to be informed. Professional courtesy." Roy returned to Cobber Crossing on a Saturday, 3 weeks after he'd left, with the reassignment orders in his saddlebag, and the feeling of a man who has finally, after a very long time of working against himself, decided to stop. He rode into town at mid-morning and tied McCaffrey at the post outside the eating house and went inside. And Elvira was behind the counter, and she looked up when he came in, and the look on her face was the look he was going to spend the rest of his life being the reason for. "You're back," she said. "I'm back," he said. "And I've been reassigned to Fort Leaton, 22 miles east." Something moved across her face that was not quite surprise, because she didn't quite allow herself surprise, but was the next thing over from it. "How did you manage that?" "I explained the situation to the captain," he said. "The whole situation, the whole situation." She studied him. "That must have been a conversation." "He took it better than expected," Roy said. "He wants to be informed when we get married, professional courtesy." Elvira set down the cloth she'd been holding and looked at him with both hands on the counter and the morning light coming in through the window behind him. "Is that the proposal?" she said. Roy reached into his jacket and put a small box on the counter between them. He'd stopped in Agniet on the way back and talked to the jeweler there, a serious older man who had spent a long time showing Roy stones, until Roy had found one that looked, he thought, like it would suit her. Not flashy or delicate, but a clear, direct, dark stone set plainly in good silver, the kind of thing you wore because you meant it rather than because you wanted to be looked at. Elvira opened the box and looked at the ring for a long moment. "Roy," she said. "Elvira," he said. She looked up. Her eyes were very bright. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes. Did you think I was going to say no?" "I wasn't entirely certain," he admitted. She picked up the ring and slid it onto her finger and looked at it there, and Roy came around the counter because there was no reason to stay on the other side of it, and she turned toward him, and he held her face in his hands the way you hold something you have finally understood the value of, and kissed her for the first time. And the first time was exactly right, steady and certain, and without any of the hesitation that had cost them both so much. Martha walked in from outside approximately 30 seconds later, took one look at the two of them, said, "About time," and went back outside. They were married 6 weeks later in Cobber Crossing, in the open air between the eating house and the Mendoza family's property, because the settlement had no formal church, and neither of them required the building as much as the commitment. The presiding official was a circuit judge named Hargreaves, who came through the territory monthly, and who performed the ceremony with the brisk efficiency of a man who had married many frontier couples, and understood that what mattered was the words and the witnesses and not the duration of the proceedings. Captain Aldridge attended. He had ridden 50 miles to do so, which Roy had not expected, and he stood at the back of the small gathering of Cobber Crossing residents with the expression of a man who had arrived out of duty and was finding it more moving than anticipated. Elvira wore a dress she had made herself, dark blue, the color of the sky just before full dark, which suited her in a way that something fussier would not have. She wore her hair in its usual braid, and she stood across from Roy in the desert morning light, and said her vows in the direct, clear way she said everything, not performing them but meaning them, and Roy said his back with the same quality. And when Hargreaves pronounced them married and Roy kissed his wife for the second time, the assembled residents of Cobber Crossing made considerably more noise than their numbers would have predicted. Mr. Sandoval cried. Nobody mentioned it to him. The first year of their marriage had the quality of a thing that has been a long time arriving and is therefore understood, when it comes, with unusual clarity. Roy rode out to Fort Leaton on Monday mornings and rode back on Friday evenings, and this rhythm, which would have seemed to him in his previous life like a compromise or a constraint, felt instead like the structure that gave the rest of it its weight. He rode home on Friday evenings, and the lights of Cobber Crossing came up out of the desert, and he felt, every time, the same thing, a feeling he had no better word for than right. He helped Elvira expand the eating house during those first months. She had plans she'd been holding in her head for 2 years, a second room for dining, a proper kitchen separated from the front, and Roy discovered that he had, somewhere under 11 years of ranging, a decent aptitude for construction work that he had simply never had occasion to apply. They worked on it together on weekends. Roy and the Mendoza brothers and old Sandoval, who was more useful than his age suggested, and who appeared to regard Roy's integration into the community as a personal success. The territory itself was shifting during those years. The cattle barons were in their period of greatest power, and the attendant injustices, the displacement of small farmers, the corruption of local law, the treatment of the Mexican families who had been on the land before the Anglo settlers, were daily realities that Roy saw from his position as ranger with a clarity that alternated between motivating and crushing. Elvira saw them from her position as the center of Cabra Crossing's social and informational life, because people talked to her, the way people always talked to whoever held the space where food was made and served, and what she heard she shared with Roy in the evenings, and what he could act on he acted on, and what he could not he had to make a certain peace with, though the peace was always provisional. There was a period, in the second year of their marriage, when a land speculator named Crane arrived in the territory with a set of documents that he claimed gave him rights to the water access that 3 small ranching families depended on, including the Mendozas. Roy recognized the type from Elvira's description of Franklin Geer, the hidden motive, the forged arrangements, the displacement disguised as legal process. He spent 2 months working through the legal records, riding to the county seat repeatedly, corresponding with a lawyer in San Antonio who had a reputation for exactly this kind of work, and eventually establishing that Crane's documents were fraudulent, a fact that got Crane indicted and the water rights restored. The Mendoza family held a dinner in their honor that lasted most of the night, and the food was extraordinary, and Elvira sat beside Roy at the long outdoor table in the warm evening, and leaned against his shoulder at one point in a way that she did not do in public as a rule, and he put his arm around her, and felt the kind of contentment that he had spent most of his adult life not believing was available to him. She told him she was expecting their first child on a February morning, sitting across from him at the breakfast table with a cup of coffee in her hands and the directness she brought to all significant information. "You're sure?" he said. "Doctor." "Whitmore confirmed it yesterday," she said. "I'm about 3 months along." Roy sat with this for a moment. He felt something very large and somewhat terrifying and entirely welcome settle into the room with them. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm well," she said. "I was sick for about 6 weeks, but not severely. I'm past that now." She studied him across the table. "You've gone a particular shade of pale." "I'm absorbing it," he said. She smiled, not the contained smile she gave to customers, or the wry smile she had for situations that had a dark comedy to them, but the full smile she gave to him when there was no need for any management of it. "You're going to be very good at this," she said. "I'm going to need you to tell me that several more times before I believe it," he said. "I know," she said. "I will." The child was born in September of 1884 in the back room that had been the room where Roy had sat beside her bed during the fever and told her he wouldn't leave again. The room had been made comfortable for the purpose, and Dr. Whitmore came from Anyate, and Martha was there, and the labor was long but not complicated. And when Roy was brought in afterward and the child was placed in his arms, he found that the thing that arrived in him had no language attached to it. It was simply enormous and complete, and it reorganized everything. "A boy," the midwife who had arrived with Dr. Whitmore announced, as though Roy might not have worked this out from context. Roy looked at Elvira, who was exhausted and luminous in the way of women who have just accomplished something extraordinary and know it, and she looked back at him with a tiredness that was also a kind of triumph. "His name," Roy said. "I thought Samuel," she said. "Samuel Hayes." Roy looked at the small, red-faced, furiously alive person in his arms and thought that Samuel was, in fact, exactly right. Samuel Hayes was, from his earliest days, very clearly his mother's son. He had her eyes, that direct dark brown, and her habit of watching everything carefully before deciding what he thought about it, and her way of going very still when something interested him, and Elvira found this both touching and slightly uncanny. He had Roy's coloring and Roy's size, which was apparent early, and a stubborn quality that both of them recognized as native to both of them and had the potential to be complicated. Roy was present for the first years of Samuel's life, with a completeness that he had not imagined possible within the structure of his work. And this was partly due to the reassignment to Fort Leaton and partly due to the fact that he had renegotiated, quietly and over time, his understanding of what duty meant and what it required. He had been a ranger who had treated the work as the entire architecture of his life, and now he was a ranger who treated the work as the important and meaningful thing it was, and came home on Friday evenings. The second pregnancy came when Samuel was 2 years old, and Elvira managed this one with the additional competence of someone who knew what to expect, and the child arrived in the early spring of 1887 without the prolonged drama of the first. A girl this time. Elvira named her Clara. Clara was, from the beginning, more like Roy in temperament than Samuel was, quieter, more internal, slower to commit to a position but more immovable once committed, with a way of looking at a situation from all sides before acting that Roy recognized with some amusement as identical to his own younger self. She had Elvira's coloring and Elvira's hair, and she followed her mother around the eating house from the time she could walk with a devoted attention that Elvira received with visible pleasure. The eating house expanded again. By 1888, it occupied a proper building, 2 separate rooms for dining and a full kitchen, and a small room that Roy had built specifically for the bookshelf. Because the collection had grown beyond what any single shelf could contain, and Elvira had developed a system of lending and tracking that rivaled the organization of a small library. People came from other settlements to borrow books, and she kept records of who had what and when it was due back, and the system was maintained with the same unsentimental efficiency that she applied to everything. Roy was promoted to senior ranger at Fort Leaton in 1888, which came with more responsibility and slightly less daily field work, and a salary that allowed him to stop worrying about the financial dimensions of the life they'd built. He had always sent his wages home, and Elvira had always managed them with extraordinary competence, but the additional income meant that they could set money aside in a way that had not been possible before, and there was a particular satisfaction in security earned rather than merely hoped for. He left the Rangers in 1891. Not dramatically, not under any cloud or confrontation, but with the simple understanding that 11 years plus 9 more was enough, that he had done the work well and completely, and that the territory had changed enough that the particular role he had filled was becoming something different, more administrative, less aligned with the values that had made it meaningful to him. He spoke to Aldridge, who had been made regional commander by then, and whose own hair had gone completely gray, and who received Roy's resignation with the expression of a man who had seen it coming for some time. "You were always going to end up here," Aldridge said, meaning not the specific moment but the shape of it, the man settled and rooted and finished with motion as a way of life. "I know," Roy said. "I just needed some time to catch up with myself." He came home on a Tuesday rather than a Friday, and Elvira looked up from the counter where she was calculating the month's accounts and said, "You're early." "I'm done," he said. She set down her pencil. She did not perform surprise because she had known this was coming, had seen the shape of it in him over the past year, in the particular quality of his restlessness on Sunday evenings before he rode out. "Done," she said. "Done," he confirmed. She held out her hand across the counter. He took it. Outside, Samuel, who was 7 now and had his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness in perfect combination, was running across the yard in front of the building in pursuit of a dog of uncertain breed that had attached itself to the establishment 2 months prior, and been unable to detach despite the complete lack of encouragement from anyone except Samuel, who had named it Harrison. Clara, 4 years old, was sitting on the porch steps watching Samuel with the expression of someone who has assessed the activity and found it neither interesting nor necessary, but is reserving judgment. Roy went out and sat beside Clara on the porch steps, and she leaned against his arm with the comfort of a child who has never had cause to doubt the person beside her. And they watched Samuel and the dog in the blue sky of the Texas afternoon, and the dry wind came across the desert bringing the smell of sage and distance. And Roy Hayes, who had ridden away from things for most of his adult life, sat still and felt, without reservation or residual fear, exactly where he was supposed to be. Elvira came out and sat on his other side, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into him. And the years that had brought them to this porch and this afternoon had been complicated and sometimes painful, and had contained, on both their parts, failures of courage and failures of honesty, and the particular private suffering of two people who have found the thing they needed and then been afraid of it. None of that was gone. It was all still in them, the way significant things stay in you. But it had been transformed by what they'd built with it into something that was now foundation rather than wound, and the difference was that foundation held weight. The settlement of Cobber Crossing had grown significantly in the years since Elvira had arrived with one trunk and a plan. It was not a large town even now, not by the standards of places that had railroads or major commerce, but it was a real community with real permanence. And the eating house that Elvira had built from a two-room operation was now the social center of it, the place where people gathered for meals and news and the occasional heated argument about the county elections and the borrowing of books. In the fall of 1891, 3 months after Roy left the Rangers, a young man arrived in Cobber Crossing on a broken-down horse with a letter of introduction from Captain Aldridge and a request for work. His name was Dennett, and he was 23 and newly arrived from Georgia and trying to make something of himself in the West, and he was so obviously earnest and so clearly in need of a meal that Elvira put him to work without lengthy deliberation. Dennett turned out to be an excellent addition to the operation. He had no skill at cooking but considerable aptitude for repair and construction and management, and over the following 2 years, he learned the business with the diligence of someone who had found his place. Roy recognized in him a version of his younger self. The one before the Rangers had given him a structure to fit inside, and gave him the kind of patient, practical guidance he would have benefited from at 23. By the summer of 1892, the eating house had a new addition that included 4 small rooms for overnight travelers, which made it technically a hotel as well, and the community regularly referred to it simply as Brooks Hayes, which was what Elvira had put above the door after she and Roy had discussed naming it for about a week, and landed on the joint name as the most accurate description of what it actually was. Samuel, 8 years old by the summer of 1892, had his mother's capacity for gathering information and his father's instinct for when it mattered. He had appointed himself unofficial assistant to Dennett in the construction projects, which Dennett handled with the patience of someone who didn't mind a small person handing him nails and asking detailed questions about load-bearing walls. Clara was 5 and had developed a passionate attachment to the books in the shelf room that Elvira received with visible satisfaction, lending her daughter the same access she gave the community and conducting the same conversations with her that she'd once conducted with Roy, about what the words meant and what the stories were trying to say. Roy, no longer a ranger, found that he was not without purpose. The territory still had injustices, the pressures on small land owners, the ongoing diminishment of the people who had been on the land before any of them, the occasional bad actor who moved into a community and tried to exploit it. He was no longer a ranger, but he was a former ranger with a considerable reputation and a network of contacts across the territory, and there were things he could do in that capacity, legal matters he could pursue through lawyers he knew, complaints he could bring to officials who still respected what he had been. He did this work in the mornings, typically, at the small desk he had set up in the room behind the shelf room, and in the afternoons he was in the kitchen or on the roof or wherever construction needed to happen, and in the evenings he was at the table with Elvira and the children, and this was the shape of the days, and it was sufficient and more than sufficient. The third child arrived in 1893, another boy, whom they named George. George had Roy's coloring and Elvira's precise, systematic way of approaching problems, and from very early on, he displayed an interest in plants and growing things that seemed to come from neither of his parents directly, but that both of them found quietly enchanting. They put in a garden behind the kitchen that fall, initially to supply the eating house with fresh produce, and George, who was barely walking, displayed such intense interest in the proceedings that Roy built him a small raised bed of his own, about the height of a 3-year-old's ambitions, and they grew tomatoes and peppers in it that George tended with enormous seriousness. Old Mr. Sandoval died in the winter of 1893, which was a grief for the whole community, in particular for Elvira, who had known him longer than almost anyone else in Cobber Crossing, and who had appreciated his regular complaints about the coffee as a form of devotion. They buried him in the small cemetery on the eastern edge of town, and Elvira spoke a few words at the service that were, like everything she said, direct and true and without ornament, and several people cried without reservation. Martha, who was now in her 60s and had no family of her own, had become so integrated into the life of Brooks Hayes that she was essentially family, and she and Elvira had developed over the years the kind of friendship that women who have helped each other through difficult things develop, the deep, unsentimental, practical kind that shows up in moments of crisis without announcement and without requiring thanks. Roy, watching Elvira across the kitchen one evening, thought about the telegram. About the 2 in the morning moment, when he'd stood in his doorway with the paper in his hand, and the desert wind on his face, and the absolute certainty that there was only one direction to go. He thought about the night ride and the 60 miles and McCaffrey's steady hooves on the hardpan, and about walking into the back room and seeing her in the bed with the fever and the dark hair loose on the pillow, and those direct brown eyes opening and finding him. He thought about the fact that she had sent that telegram without knowing for certain that he would come, that she had held his name in her heart through 3 years of silence and had sent it into the telegraph wire as a kind of faith, a bet placed on something she could not be certain of but felt in some essential way to be true. The courage of that, he thought, was the actual thing. Not his night ride, which had been practically automatic, but her willingness to ask. For someone who had been asking nothing from anyone for her entire adult life, that telegram had been an extraordinary act of trust, and he understood it now more completely than he had at the time when he had only understood that he had to go. "What are you thinking about?" Elvira asked, without looking up from the account she was working on. "The telegram," he said. She looked up then. "The telegram from 9 years ago." "Yes." She held his look for a moment. "What about it?" "I was thinking about how much courage it took to send it," he said, "for you specifically, given how you were made and what you'd come from." Elvira was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was genuinely considering something rather than formulating a response. "I was scared to send it," she said. "I lay in that bed for most of a day arguing with myself. Martha kept suggesting practical alternatives and I kept saying no to all of them and not being able to explain why." "Why did you finally send it?" "Because I was more scared of not sending it," she said. "Because when I actually imagined you not knowing, not being there, it was worse than the risk of asking and being refused." She looked at the ring on her finger, the dark stone in the plain silver setting, still clear and direct after 9 years. "And I knew, underneath all the arguing, that you would come. I didn't know exactly why you would come because we hadn't named things yet, but I knew." Roy got up from his chair and came around the table to where she was sitting, and she looked up at him with those brown eyes that had been looking directly at things for as long as he'd known her, and he took her face in his hands the way he had on the first Friday he'd come home, the gesture that was by now entirely familiar and entirely new every time, and she put her hands over his. "I'm glad you knew," he said. "So am I," she said. Samuel appeared in the doorway, tracked in from the yard by the smell of supper that Dennett had started in the kitchen, with a long scratch on his forearm from an encounter with the fence post he would describe later in considerable detail. He stopped when he saw his parents and made the particular face that 8-year-olds make when they encounter adult moments they do not have the vocabulary for. "Is everything all right?" he asked. "Everything is all right," Roy told him. "Dennett burned something again," Samuel reported, moving through the room toward the kitchen. "It smells like hat." Roy looked at Elvira and she looked at Roy, and both of them were trying not to smile, which meant neither of them was trying very hard. The years that followed continued to have the quality of days that are lived completely, not perfectly, because nothing is perfect, and the territory continued to produce difficulties, and there were droughts and disputes, and the particular ongoing challenge of raising 3 children in a place that was in the process of becoming something other than what it had been, the frontier hardening into settled country. The old ways of doing things giving way to newer ways that were sometimes better and sometimes simply different. Clara growing into a young woman of 12, and then 15, and then 17 with her father's quietness and her mother's sharpness, developed a formal interest in law that both her parents received with a complex mixture of pride and the awareness of what it meant for a woman to want that in 1899. Elvira, who had navigated the injustices of her own path with clear-eyed pragmatism, sat with Clara through many evenings discussing it, not discouraging her, but equipping her with the understanding of what she would need and what she would face. Roy wrote letters on Clara's behalf to a women's academy in San Antonio that had begun offering courses in legal studies, and Clara went there at 17 with the look of someone who has been heading somewhere for a long time and has finally arrived at the road that goes there. Samuel, older and increasingly indistinguishable from a young man who was going to be formidable in whatever he turned his hand to, took a deep and abiding interest in the law of a different kind, the practical frontier law that Roy had practiced, and Roy spent considerable time riding out with him across the territory, showing him what a carefully attentive person could read in land and in people, and in the way things were arranged. The same instincts that had made Roy a good ranger now being passed on in the informal transmission of a father who knows what his son might need. George, who was never going to be a lawman and showed no inclination toward any kind of confrontation with anything that wasn't a plant, turned out to have a gift for agriculture that went beyond the small raised bed of his toddlerhood. By the time he was 10, he was managing a substantial kitchen garden that supplied both the eating house and several neighboring families. And by 15, he was reading agricultural publications from the East with the serious attention of a scholar. Martha died in the summer of 1899. She had been ill for several months, and Elvira had been with her through all of it, the way Martha had been with Elvira 20 years earlier in the back room when the fever would not break. She died in her own bed across the road, in the room where she had lived for 25 years, with Elvira holding her hand and Roy sitting beside the window, because Martha had asked him to be there too, saying that she liked having the house full of people. They buried her next to her husband in the cemetery, and Elvira stood at the grave after everyone else had stepped away and was very still for a long time, and Roy stood behind her with his hand on her shoulder and let the stillness be what it needed to be. She turned eventually and leaned into him, and he held her in the afternoon sun beside the grave of their friend, and she did not cry, because she was Elvira, and she grieved in the interior, deliberate way that she did everything, but she held on to him with a completeness that said what words would have been insufficient for. They walked home through the town in the last of the afternoon light, past the buildings that had grown up around them over 20 years, past the people who knew them and had grown with them through all of it. And Roy had the particular feeling that comes at the end of a significant thing, not the ending of his life or Elvira's, but the ending of an era in it, the last connection to the people who had been there at the very beginning. Brooks Hayes stood at the end of the street, with the lantern light beginning to come on in the windows as the evening arrived. The sign above the door had weathered and been repainted twice, and was now comfortable with its own existence, the way things get when they have been in one place long enough to feel inevitable. The smell of supper was in the air, George's cooking by then, because George had turned out to have a gift for that too, and Dennett was sitting on the front porch with a newspaper and a pipe that he had adopted as an affectation of maturity around his 30th year and never relinquished. Samuel was somewhere in the territory, currently working as a deputy in the county seat, the first step in a career that was already showing the shape of something serious. He wrote letters home on a regular schedule with the methodical consistency of his mother's influence, long letters that described his work and his observations, and his occasional frustrations with the difference between how things were supposed to work and how they actually worked. Clara was in San Antonio, finishing her second year at the academy, writing letters that were shorter and more precise than Samuel's, and contained an energy that Roy recognized as the energy of someone who is finally doing the exact thing they were made for. George appeared in the doorway of Brooks Hayes with a wooden spoon and the expression of a person monitoring something on the stove. "Supper in half an hour," he said. "Do not let Dennett convince you otherwise. He ate an entire piece of cornbread while I was not looking, and he is not having any of that again." Dennett did not look up from his newspaper. It was a small piece. "It was the size of a hat," George said, and went back inside. Elvira made a sound beside Roy that was the sound she made when she was amused and was not going to admit it, and Roy felt it in the arm he had around her shoulders, the slight movement of it, and he looked at her profile in the beginning of the evening light, the familiar shape of it, the jaw and the wide mouth and the scar above the eyebrow that had come from a cabinet door at age 9, and he thought about all the mornings he had ridden away before she could ask him what he was afraid of. And about the morning he had finally stopped. He had left his post for the first time in 11 years because she had no one else to call, and everything that followed had been the consequence of that single clear decision, the decision to stop managing what he felt and simply be where she was. She turned and looked at him, catching him looking at her, and she raised one eyebrow with the expression that said she knew exactly what he was thinking. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Everything." She shook her head with the fond exasperation that had become one of the primary notes of their marriage. "Come inside," she said. "George will be wounded if the soup is cold." He followed her up the porch steps and through the door of the place they had built together, past Dennett, who said good evening without looking up, past the shelf room where the books were arranged in Elvira's precise system, and where Clara had spent whole afternoons on rainy days, and where George had fallen asleep more than once between volumes about soil composition and crop rotation, into the warm interior that smelled of food and use and time. The table was set for 4 because it was just the 4 of them tonight, Roy and Elvira and George and Dennett, the particular small configuration that the family took on when the older children were away, and Roy sat in his chair, the one at the end that had been his chair since the year Samuel was born, and the table had been moved to accommodate the high chair. And Elvira sat across from him, and George brought soup from the kitchen, and Dennett folded his newspaper, and they were together in the ordinary, complete way of people who have made something real and know it. Roy looked across the table at Elvira. She was 45 years old, and she looked to him, as she had always looked, which was like herself, which was the finest thing he knew how to say about anyone. The dark honey hair had silver in it now, and she wore it the same way, braided and practical, and her eyes were the same clear direct brown that had looked at him across a plate of beans and cornbread in the spring of 1879, and made him forget what word he had been about to say. She looked up and met his look and held it in the way she had always held it, without flinching, with the full attention of someone who had decided that this person was worth being fully seen by, and he held it back in kind, which was all he had ever been able to offer her, and had turned out to be exactly what was needed. George said something about the soup, and Dennett said something in response, and Elvira said something to both of them, and the conversation went on in the warm way of supper-table conversations in households where people are genuinely comfortable with each other. And the lantern light was warm, and the desert night was settling outside and somewhere across the territory. Their children were doing the things they were made to do, and Roy Hayes, who had ridden away from everything for most of his life, sat in the center of all of it and found that it was not a trap. It had never been a trap. It had always been the destination he had been crossing all that ground to reach. A letter came from Clara 3 days later, thick and longer than her usual, and when Elvira opened it at the breakfast table and read the first paragraph, she went very still in the way that meant the information was significant. "What is it?" Roy asked. "She's been offered a position," Elvira said. "Not another year of study, an actual position. A lawyer in San Antonio named Herrera who specializes in land rights cases, specifically the cases involving the wrongful displacement of Mexican landholding families. He's looking for an associate." She set the letter down and looked at Roy. "She says she wants to take it." Roy thought about this. He thought about Clara at 5 years old sitting on the porch steps, watching Samuel chase the dog, with the precise expression of someone cataloging observations for later use. He thought about Clara at 12 asking him questions about the Crane case and the land records, and how you proved a document was forged. He thought about Elvira's face when Clara had first said she wanted to study law, the complex expression that contained both pride and the knowledge of what that road would require. "Tell her to take it," Roy said. Elvira looked at him over the letter, just like that. "She's Clara," Roy said. "She'll be extraordinary at it." Elvira held his look for a moment, and then something in her face settled and cleared, and she nodded once, the nod she gave when a decision had been correctly made. She wrote back to Clara that morning, and Roy read the letter before she sealed it, because she offered it to him, and what she had written was characteristically Elvira, direct and warm and without excess, telling Clara that she was proud of her and that she should take the position, and that she should remember that the work mattered more than the recognition, and that she had the capacity for both. She added at the end, in handwriting slightly different from the body of the letter, slightly less composed, that she loved her, and that she could call on them for anything. Roy read that last part and thought of a telegram on a yellow paper arriving at a station at 2:30 in the morning. He thought of the word nobody and the way it had felt under his thumb. He thought of Elvira lying in this house in the grip of a fever and choosing, finally, after years of choosing otherwise, to ask. He looked at his wife sitting across the table with the sealed letter in her hands and the morning light on her face, and the particular history of everything they had survived and built and chosen together making itself felt in the quiet of the room. She looked back at him. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I love you." She looked at him in the way she had, direct and full and without any management of it. "I love you too," she said. "Obviously." He smiled at her, and she smiled back. And outside the Texas morning was wide and bright and entirely itself. And Cobber Crossing was waking up around them. And Brooks Hayes stood on the corner of the road where it had always stood, solid and real and full of the life they had built inside it. And Roy Hayes, who had once been a man who rode away before dawn, was exactly where he had always been going.